As a child, I loved the story of Noah. What could be more fun than a boat full of animals? Some of you may remember a song written by Shel Silverstein in 1967 and made famous by the Irish Rovers that explained why there are no longer any unicorns on Earth because they missed the ark. The chorus goes like this. There was green alligators and long-necked geese, some humpty-backed camels and some chimpanzees, some cats and rats and elephants, but sure as you're born, the loveliest of all was the unicorn. That was sung around a lot of campfires when I was young. And others of you might remember a comedy sketch by Bill Cosby in the 1960s, which is before I was born, which featured a discussion between God and Noah. And I acknowledge that Bill Cosby's legacy is problematic given his sexual misconduct allegations and convictions. And I am not condoning his behavior in offering this example. And then more recently, you might think about 2007 movie Evan Almighty. I don't know if any of you have seen that movie, where Morgan Freeman played God and instructs a congressman to build an ark. It's a compelling and interesting story of what happens in modern day if you go ahead and start building a giant boat. Lots of pop culture has picked up on this story because it's colorful and full of drama. However, when you start to look a little more closely at the story, well, it's kind of problematic too, particularly the image of God presented in it. Lots of questions start popping up. What does it mean to say that God regretted making humanity because of our violence? Why does God destroy the entire world except for Noah's family? Does that imply that some people are worth saving and other people are not? Is that an action that we can reconcile with an image of a loving God? And how did Noah actually get all the animals on the ark? Especially since we know now about multiple continents and a whole bunch of animals that never ever lived in the Middle East, like bison and such. And who did Noah's grandchildren marry if the only people to survive the flood were Noah's family? And how come Noah was 600 years old? Anybody here 600 years old? And how big was that ark? Yes, in some of the verses we left out to make the story short enough to read, there are dimensions. But how large would a floating zoo need to be in order to accommodate 2 of every living creature on the planet? And then what did all of those animals eat for 40 days, especially the carnivores? I could go on and on. If you take this story literally and look at it closely for factual consistency, well, it's absolutely ludicrous. It is amazing to me that there are still people looking and mounting expeditions to look for Noah's Ark. If such a structure ever existed, which I highly doubt, then it would have rotted away long ago. Wooden boats don't survive for thousands of years. Wood rots. Ask anyone who's ever had to replace a deck or a fence. Yet the same things that made me like this story when I was little are still true about it today. It's memorable and intriguing. And if we approach it like a children's story, I think it still has some wisdom to offer us. We don't ask whether there was ever a monkey called Curious George whose curiosity kept leading him into adventures and trouble, or a bear called Paddington who lived with a family in England, or whether Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry actually exists, or whether we could ever hope to find a hobbit hole. Those questions don't make sense, in the same way that it doesn't really make sense to worry about how Noah kept the anteaters from eating the ants. Yet we can and do learn a lot of wisdom from children's stories, and we can learn from this one too. One of the neat things that happens when we engage story as story, rather than as history, is we often see and wonder about different things each time we hear or read the story. And so while I'm often skeptical about the 5 things I learned from this Bible story list that you can see, because often it oversimplifies complex stories and misses the depth, I think this is a story that is really actually better to dabble with. If you dig deep, you solve the problems. But if we talk about the story just as a story, well then there's some room to be playful with it. So here's 5 things I noticed this time thinking about the story of Noah. Hopefully one or more of them will intrigue you enough to ponder whether it has anything to say to your life context today. So the first is that sin happens. I don't know about you, but when I mess up, I can immediately start to feel like I am the only person who ever made such a big mess of things. Then I hear stories like Noah, as well as the other stories in this first part of the book of Genesis about Adam and Eve in the garden, about Cain and Abel, or about the Tower of Babel, which is the story right after this one. And I remember that human beings have been messing up things and grieving the heart of God, well, since there have been human beings on this planet. That's not a reason not to try our best, but it is a reminder that in our sinfulness, we are not alone. Second, it's okay to be eccentric. Imagine you were Noah's friend or neighbor. What would you have thought about this man building a giant boat in his backyard and collecting animals to go in it? At minimum, you would have found it odd, and possibly you might have thought that he was losing his mind. If you sometimes do something that other people think is strange or eccentric, well, that might mean you are onto something, even if it is countercultural or ahead of its time. Three, plan for future generations and care for all God's creatures. Noah's Ark is a story about trying to preserve all living species for the future amid a time of destruction. And as we consider climate change and other environmental challenges of our day, it's important as people of faith to keep in mind how our actions or inaction might impact those who come after us. The story of Noah reminds us that God cares about creation, both humans and every other creature, and God charges us to care for and preserve all life. Number 4, get busy and build something. I skipped all the details about how to build this enormous boat when I abridged the scripture reading for this Sunday, but the measurements are all there in chapter 6 of Genesis. Whether they would actually work to build a boat, I don't know, because I'm not an expert in boat building. However, this is a story about getting busy and building something. Whether it's a social change movement, or a home, or a church, or a business, or a relationship, or a work of art. Building creatively is part of our calling as humans. Each of us has a part to play in building the world up, both for the good of those who are around us right now, and for the good of those who will come after us. And finally, number 5, look for the rainbow. This isn't a story like the children's song we sang said, with a happily ever after ending. In fact, in just the next chapter, there's this whole mess when Noah grows grapes, makes wine, and ends up drunk and passed out in his tent. So it isn't a happily ever after story. It isn't if there's no more rain, and there's no more flooding, and there's no more struggle. The story does tell us, though, that every time God sees a rainbow, God will remember the covenant that God has made with all living things, never again to destroy all life on earth. So when it's pouring rain in your life, or everything seems to be drowning, look for the rainbow. It might or might not be an actual rainbow. It might be a phone call from a friend. It might be flowers in the garden. It might be a moment of silliness. It might be calm in the midst of struggle. It might be the vastness of the night sky or the beauty of a sunrise. It might be a newborn child. It might be something that you can't quite describe. But you'll recognize it, because when you notice and pay attention to it, even for a moment, your sense of hope is strengthened. So I'm still wrestling with this story this week. I've considered starting again on this sermon many times, and I'm not quite satisfied with how it turned out. I have more questions than I can answer when it comes to this particular Bible story. But maybe that's the function of a good story, to leave us with questions. May God gift us with wisdom in the midst of all our questioning. Amen.